On my first day of rabbinical school, the president of the university was late for a reception for the new students. When he finally arrived, he apologized and explained that as he was leaving his office, the phone rang. He picked up the phone, and it was a friend of his, a prominent sociologist who was compiling the data statistics of the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey. The results hadn't come out yet, and the president was anxious to find out. So what's it going to show, he asked. And his friend said, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is Judaism will exist in 100 years. The bad news is it will be unrecognizable to us. What I'd like to share with you today is why this one queer Jew doesn't think that an unrecognizable Judaism is particularly bad news. I once heard my friend, Rabbi Lisa Edwards, teach something to her students that I'll never forget. She said if donkeys read Torah, all the donkey stories would jump out at them. Right? Every time they'd see a donkey, they'd go, there's me. There I am again. All the donkey stories they'd see. All the donkey stories that we completely miss. When I began to learn Talmud, all the donkey stories, my donkey stories, started jumping out at me. And when I connected the dots, I saw a tradition that was smarter, more sophisticated, more courageous, compassionate, bolder, and more radical than anything I could have imagined. And I fell in love. Today, for the first time in history, queer Jews are learning Talmud as queer Jews and seeing in it things that our teachers never taught us. What I think I'm figuring out is that all human beings share the same basic big questions of life. Why are we here? What's our purpose? How should I live my life? Every culture, every tradition, every religion comes into being for one and only one reason: to answer those basic human questions. And it does so by means of a master story. If you're Jewish, your master story is Torah. And if it's successful, a story can last a really long time. But every story will ultimately and inevitably crash. You'll find a more compelling story whose answers you like better. Or an event will occur that makes your story's answers no longer workable. Or something inside of you has shifted. You've changed. And those old answers just don't seem true anymore. Now you've got to figure out who you are, what you believe, and how you're going to live your life. There are 3 and only 3 possible responses to any crash ever. Option 1, you can deny the crash and return to your master story and take refuge there. And you're going to build a wall around that story to shore it up and make sure that no threatening information gets in. You're going to keep all your goodies, but you're going to pay a price for that. Or you can go option 2. You can accept the crash and completely reject your master story and jump off into a new story. That's the baby with the bathwater option. And remember, every story will ultimately and inevitably crash, and this story too is going to crash, and you're going to have to jump off of it into another story and yet another, and on and on. Most people go option 1 or option 2 after any crash, especially option 2. That's just what most people do. And if you look closely, you'll see that option 1 and option 2 are opposite sides of the same coin. They share the same wrong-headed underlying premise that stories are fixed, eternal, unchanging, and immutable. But stories do crash. It's not bad news. It's not an unfortunate fact of life. It is life. That's how life nudges us forward. And so there's a third option, and that's good news. The biggest crash in Jewish history happened 2,000 years ago with the destruction of the Second Temple. I'm going to crank you back 1 year to the year 69, when the temple was still standing, and see how these options played out. Okay, who was going option 1 2,000 years ago? Hint. If you're employed by the master story, if you earn your living from it, you're going to be an option 1 person. So, of course, it was the priests who were going option 1. Sure, they couldn't imagine any other way to be a human being. And so they did whatever it would take, even fight to the death to preserve their way of being Jewish. Okay, who went option 2? Historical records tell us that 90% of the Jewish people went option 2 after the destruction. 90%. They left Judaism completely and melted into the Roman Empire. It was over. Everybody knew that. Except for one small group of queer, fringy, radical, outsider, hippie guys. Fewer than are in this room right now, who had a different idea. They went option 3. They accepted the crash, embraced the crash, went back to the tradition, took with them what still worked, mixed the old with the new, and created a radically new tradition, a radical new Judaism that would have been unrecognizable to a temple Jew. If you're Jewish today, that's because your great-great-great-great-grandparents were part of that 10% who got what these guys were up to, who said, I see what you're doing. I see. Doesn't feel very Jewish to me, but it will to my grandchildren. So count me in. And I should note that these guys who created this Judaism, these fringy, queer, disenfranchised guys, oh, by the way, we call them rabbis now, right? Yeah. They created this Judaism while the temple was still standing. They were meeting in little retreat centers called synagogues. Well, they could just as easily have gone to the temple down the block. But temple Judaism wasn't working for them. It had long since crashed for them, even while the temple was still standing. And the option 3 Judaism that they created was only one of many Judaisms that sprang up in the years following the destruction. And that's good. That's exactly what you want. At a time of crash, you want as many option 3s as possible, because you never know which one's going to work, right? These guys knew that crashes happen, and crashes would happen over and over again. So they built into their system mechanisms for responding to crash. And they said that in order to be a leader, to be a player, all you needed was not rabbinic ordination. You didn't need a title. You needed 2 things, to be gamirna and savirna. Gamirna, to be learned, to be learning, and to be savirna, to possess svara, moral intuition. The word svara is an Aramaic word that literally means reason. But the rabbis expanded the concept from a mere logical deduction to encompass deep insight, moral intuition. What your kishkis tell you is right, as long as you're steeped in the principles, values, and texts of the tradition. And the rabbis elevated svara to the level of Torah. They said it's d'oraita, straight from God. And that svara could even trump Torah if the 2 conflicted. It's wild, right? Even a little scary. That's probably why you've never heard of the concept of svara. It's rarely taught. Because in a time of enormous change, like now, concepts like this that make radical change possible get suppressed, precisely when we need them most. But the rabbis recorded all of this in a how-to manual for players of the future. We call that manual Talmud. I'd like to learn a little Talmud with you tonight. You game? Okay. It's from Ketubot 2b. And it's a story of a woman whose husband has gone on a long journey. And knowing that journeys are dangerous, particularly as they were for Jews at that time, He's given her a conditional get, a divorce document that would go into effect if he didn't return within 30 days. Now, why does he give her such a thing? He doesn't want to divorce her. He loves her. And he knows that if he should go missing and not return, his wife would remain without this document, an aguna, forever chained to a husband who is not present and forbidden by Jewish law to remarry or have children in the future. 30 days have passed, and the husband doesn't return. The condition has been fulfilled. The woman has a valid get in her hand. She's a divorced woman, free to remarry. What is she going to do now? Rava, a 4th century rabbi, knows that it's very likely she's going to say to herself, something must have happened to him. Surely he's been detained. I know he loves me. I know he wants to come back. But something has happened. He can't get back. But he will come back. I know he will. And she'll wait. Because she knows correctly that according to Jewish law, if you are forced to do something that you don't want to do, or prevented from doing something that you do want to do, the Torah gives you a get-out-of-jail-free card. Right? The consequences of force majeure, ones in Hebrew, are excused, undone. And so this woman knows that her husband can come back even after the 30-day period and say, I was detained against my will, but now I'm free and I'm back, and let's rip up the get, and we'll still be married. God says, I can do that. Torah gives him that right, says so in the Torah. At least that's how the rabbis understand it. And so she'll wait. But what if, in fact, her husband has run off? Maybe he's met another woman, and he isn't coming back. Rava knows that this woman will continue to believe, my husband is coming back. Surely he'll come back. And she'll sit and wait forever, and make herself an aguna. Rava's heart breaks for this woman. He sees a piece of Torah that's causing her enormous suffering, and he does something about it. He does what you and I have been told can't be done. He overturns Torah for her. He declares, Ein ones begitin. No longer will anyone be able to declare, I was detained, I was honest, and have that marriage undone when it comes to gets. No longer will a woman with a valid get in her hand wait in vain for a husband to return who has in fact deserted her. The Talmud then asks, on what authority did Rava do this? And Rava says that his authority, his source, isn't a verse in the Torah. It's not some legal precedent. His source is his svara, his moral intuition. His empathy for this woman has crashed his Torah, and his love of Torah compels him to make Torah better. And the narrator's voice comes in and says to Rava, do you mean to tell me that simply on account of these women you're going to abrogate Torah? And Rava responds with a single Aramaic word, in. Yes. Some Talmudic dictionaries define this word differently. Yes, indeed. Some read this story and see a story about agunot, or a story about a particular woman in a particular circumstance. For me, it's a donkey story. I see myself in this story. And by the way, it's one of thousands of donkey stories in the Talmud. I see a woman who's suffering at the hands of verse pointers who are saying, but it says right here in the Torah. I know what that's like. And I see the courage of a man who stands up and simply declares, I'm doing this because my svara tells me so. Just as the life experience of that woman crashed Rava's Torah. The life experience of so many of us is crashing our Torah. The donkeys in this story aren't just queer Jews like me. They're every Jew who's been pushed from the tradition for one reason or another. We are at the tail end of a crash, and the option 3 future is going to be unrecognizable to most of us. But it will be created, just like before, by the queer, outsider, disenfranchised of today. Every one of you here is somewhere on that map. You're going option 1, option 2, or option 3 on your Judaism. If you're going option 3, you're the future. Hang in there. Hang on to your queerness. Own your otherness. That's where your svara comes from. Most of your fellow Jews aren't going to be following you. That's okay. That's how it works. And the Judaism you create may not even work that well for you. But in time, it'll get thicker, it'll get better, and it may just work for your grandchildren. We don't need a Rava to stand up for us like Rava stood up for that woman. Because now we know that if we're Gamirna and Savirna, if we are learned, learning, and refining our svara, then we are no longer that woman. We are Rava. Thank you.
Thanks for watching Eli Talks. Click through or subscribe to the Eli Talks channel for more inspired Jewish ideas.